Hi, I'm Ross, and I'm going to be doing a presentation on David Wojnarowicz. So, David Wojnarowicz was a Polish-American queer artist, and his early life was very much characterized by abuse, turmoil, and sexual trauma, which would very much categorize the sort of art he would make later on in his life. So he was born September 14th in 1954 in Red Bank, New Jersey, and his parents actually divorced 2 years after his birth. But his father abducted David and his older siblings, and they stayed in Michigan for a while until eventually, in the early 1960s, he was finally handed back over custody to his mother, who initially was supposed to have them. And this is where David would be introduced to New York. And this New York area is where he would eventually be flourishing. But first, he was unfortunately faced with a lot of seedy characters and a lot of old men who preyed upon him. And so he was subjected to a lot of sexual trauma because he was poorly supervised as a child. So from the ages of 12 to 15, he was very much preyed upon sexually. And he would, at 14, begin attending high school of music and art in Manhattan. But because of all this turmoil, he never actually graduated. So from the ages of 17 to 19, he was homeless. And he was making his way around different cities, really most of the time selling his body to make money to survive. And it wasn't until he was 19 that he finally entered a halfway house and got his GED. And this is when he really started making poetry, writing, and he ended up working as a busboy at this favorite club called Danceteria, where Keith Haring would actually be working. So he was around a lot of other artists of the time, and the most significant would be Peter Hujar, who was a photographer and would eventually become his mentor, but additionally his partner. And he would die of AIDS, which would really propel Wojnarowicz's work into a place of activism, and specifically around the injustices done to queer and minority communities during the AIDS epidemic, which he would eventually be diagnosed with AIDS after the death of his partner. And that would really identify the sort of artworks of that period in time. But his art primarily was influenced by graffiti street art, trauma, death, queerness, poverty, and overall activism. Because of this is what shaped him. So his body of work really spans every medium. He was a painter. He did street art, which is what he began with along the Lower East Side of Manhattan, New York. He really began by stenciling with spray cans this image of a house on fire. And he also went into photography, written literature. He published several books, the first of which would be in 1982, which would be a compilation of different stories of these characters that he met during his time as being homeless. And all the different stories he came upon, and he referred to these people as somewhat like himself, not fitting into this pre-invented world, which is what he sort of identified the world as being, where you're born into with language and social and those sort of boundaries that really affected him and other people. And those would always also bleed into Super 8 films. He had several films or collaborations with other artists. He did photography, performance art, and he even published independent EPs for a band that he created called Three Teens Kill Four, which is very indicative of this anger that he held in himself from his traumatic childhood, as well as which would be really expressed in his Super 8 films, very much categorized by this trauma and familial abuse, sexual trauma. So this piece I felt is very important. And it is one of his later works. It's made 2 years before his death in 1992. So this is titled One Day This Kid, and it's from 1990. And I'll only read a small portion of this, but it's very indicative of the traumatic experience of growing up queer. So this kid will be faced with electroshock, drugs, and conditioning therapies in laboratories tended by psychologists and research scientists. He will be subject to loss of home, civil rights, jobs, and all conceivable freedoms. All this will begin to happen in 1 or 2 years when he discovers he desires to place his naked body on the naked body of another boy. So this is reflective of his childhood trauma, predominantly as being a gay man. And so this is actually an image of him as a child. These are some other important pieces from him. This one is another incredibly significant one a few years before his death. So this is actually after the death of his partner, Peter Hujar. So this is a newspaper clipping which has paint and all other things meshed into it. But really the most important piece that's overlaid upon this newspaper clipping, which is about the AIDS epidemic. I mean, it discusses how if someone only had a few dollars to donate, they would rather donate it to a baby or something that wasn't at fault for their ailment, rather than someone with AIDS, which they really perceived as something that was their fault. It was the fault of them being gay or being a user. And so they're really denied these inherent rights of health and dignity because of this disease. And so superimposed over this newspaper clipping are actually pictures of his dead partner. So this is Peter Hujar's face, his feet, and his skinny hands. This is another one that's indicative of his criticisms towards society. And so the newspaper as National Voodoo, A Brief History of the USA. So obviously the centerpiece is a voodoo doll, there's a piece of meat, there's a fly. And this is actually him in front of this piece. And it's a discussion of how the way the media portrays things, newspapers, mass media, it really is the underpinnings of the US, and it shapes public opinion, and it really forms lives and destroys lives, which is why there's a negative connotation, national voodoo, directly pinpointing this, we're gonna hurt this, that sort of idea. Here's the Lazaretto, which is also, I find, incredibly important to understanding where he comes from. So this is a collaboration installation with Paul Marcus and Susan Pizzao. And so a Lazaretto, if you don't know, is essentially a quarantine. It's an isolation unit. It's where people are supposed to get better or die from a contagious disease. And this image is composed of a lot of testimonies that they gathered from different people, and they wrote them out on the walls. And so there's a haggard skeleton huddled in a messy bed in front of a television with a dead cockroach, and that's their Lazaretto. That's all they have. That's their dying dignity. And so I'll only read a small portion of this, but it says, we are living in a society that has accelerated to such a point that the person to press the button that releases warheads, the person who determines whether some of us have rights to abortion, the person who determines whether men can love men or women can love women, or whether I should have to die of lack of access to healthcare because I am Black or Hispanic or poor and white or Native American, that person no longer has to go to the scene of the crime. So this is only really 2 years before his death, and he knows he has AIDS at this point. And this really plays into this other piece as well, which is Face in Dirt, which this is Wojnarowicz, and he himself is buried in dirt. And so this is indicative not only of a burden weighing upon himself, but it's almost like a trial run for his deathbed. He knows ultimately that's where he's going. He's a gay man with AIDS without health insurance, and he's living off his art. He knows that's ultimately where this is going towards, and this is only a year before his death that this was made. And this here is an example of the burning house image that really brought him popularity. And there's many versions of this. He did it all over the East Village. He has shirts with it on. And this is one of the things that led him to be on the Whitney Biennial so-called graffiti show, which really brought his name to a wider audience. And another reason Wojnarowicz is an important artist is because of his constant fighting against censorship. So in 1990, the American Family Association essentially butchered a lot of his pieces to put in this pamphlet that was fighting to sway public opinion about the National Education Association's funding of educational institutions which would have art exhibits which had pieces like David's. And his work has always been incredibly controversial because it has a lot of sexually explicit content, but also religious symbolism and iconography. And so they would crop his large-scale pieces, take them out of context, and crop them to just a portion of sexual content. Or another image that really bothered people was Jesus with a needle in his arm, referencing the AIDS epidemic, and in sort of a sense to humanize people. And would you care about Jesus if he was also a user, if he was a gay man struggling with syringes in his arm? And really these were taken out of context, and so he actually went forward. He was represented without any cost to him. And he fought against the AFA and Donald Wildman, who was the main person who wrote the articles for the pamphlet, and which he titled them, "Your Tax Dollars Paid for This." And he sent them out, hundreds, thousands of them, displaying Wojnarowicz's artwork as just porn and defacing religious iconography, which wasn't the case. It's taken out of context. And he was actually successful in getting the court to issue an injunction against the AFA, which would force him to stop producing these immediately and send out the correction, essentially, establishing that this is not actually what this artwork was. We displayed it inaccurately, that sort of thing. However, he had been suing for $1 million for this court case because this artwork is his livelihood. But he was not able to prove through documentation or that sort of thing that it affected him financially. So he was only awarded $1, a single dollar, by the courts. And he insisted on getting a personal check from Donald Wildman for that $1. And he never cashed it in. And he wanted to essentially use it in a future art piece because he does a lot of collage work. But before his death, he never found the perfect place to put it. So this check still exists. It's in a museum, and it's essentially a ready-made. It is an artwork on its own. It's a testimony to the injustice, but also sort of an accomplishment. Because people do consider him one of the first artists to successfully sue a right-wing organization for attacking their artwork. And he continues to inspire and cause controversy many years after his death. Most recently, there was a huge exhibition at the Whitney Museum of American Art in 2018. But even going back a few years, in 2010, he was still being censored. A Super 8 film of his, which included a scene of a crucifix with ants crawling all over it, was removed from the Smithsonian in a gallery that was supposed to be portraying queer art. But it was still being censored, and this man is dead. He's not doing harm to anyone. He's not speaking out against anyone, and yet decades later he's still being shut down for being outspoken and having an opinion as a gay man, as someone affected by all these issues socially. And it prompted protests and marches, and the Andy Warhol Foundation removed future financial support from the Smithsonian. Artists tried to have their artwork taken out of this gallery exhibition, unsuccessfully, unfortunately. And there's still so much to be said about queer art and the queer community and censorship. And he stands as a big monumental person in the fight for creating a space for queer artists. Thank you.